Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The salty breeze whipped through Margaret's silver hair as she stood at the helm of the Sunflower, her bright yellow yacht gleaming in the early morning sun. Her husband Robert fiddled with the rigging, his weathered hands moving with practiced ease despite the years that had passed since their last major voyage. "Ready for the adventure of a lifetime, Maggie?" Robert called out, a boyish grin spreading across his face. Margaret nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "We've been dreaming of this for decades, Bob. I can hardly believe we're finally doing." The port of Ushuaia bustled around them, fishermen and tourists alike milling about the docks. The couple had spent the last week preparing for their journey around Cape Horn, the pinnacle of their sailing career, and the realization of a lifelong dream. As Robert made his final checks, Margaret couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. They weren't as young as they used to be, and the waters around Cape Horn were notoriously treacherous, but the thrill of adventure outweighed her concerns, and she pushed the doubts to the back of her mind. "Ahoy there!" a gruff voice called. Out. Margaret turned to see an old fisherman approaching their yacht, his face weathered by years at sea. "You folks heading out?" "Yes, we are," Robert replied, coming to stand beside his wife. "We're sailing around the Horn." The fisherman's bushy eyebrows shot up. "The Horn? In that little yellow boat?" Margaret bristled slightly at his tone. "The Sunflower may be small, but she's sturdy. We've sailed her through some rough waters before." The old man nodded, but his expression remained grave. "I'm sure you have, but the Horn is different, and lately, well..." He trailed off, glancing out at the sea. "Lately what?" Robert prompted, curiosity piqued. The fisherman sighed heavily. "There's been talk among the local sailors. Strange behavior from the Orcas in these parts." Margaret and Robert exchanged glances. They'd heard stories of Orcas attacking boats before, but had always dismissed them as exaggerations. "What kind of strange behavior?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Aggression mostly, more than usual. A few smaller boats have reported being harassed, even rammed. Nothing too serious yet, but..." He shrugged. "Just thought..." "You ought to know." Robert nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We appreciate the warning. We'll keep an eye out." The fisherman gave them a long look, then nodded. "Safe travels, then. May the sea be kind to you." As he walked away, Margaret turned to her husband. "What do you think, Bob? Should we be worried?" Robert considered for a moment, then shook his head. "We've prepared for everything, Maggie. A few overly playful whales aren't going to derail our dream trip." Margaret nodded, trying to shake off her unease. "You're right, of course. We've come too far to turn back now." With final checks complete, they cast off from the dock. The Sunflower's engine hummed to life, and they began to make their way out of the harbor. Margaret watched as the town of Ushuaia grew smaller behind them, the snow-capped peaks of Tierra del Fuego looming in the distance. As they cleared the harbor and entered open water, Robert cut the engine and unfurled the sails. The wind caught them immediately, and the Sunflower surged forward with newfound energy. "There she goes," Robert whooped, his face alight with joy. "Feel that, Maggie? That's freedom." Margaret laughed, her earlier worries melting away in the face of her husband's enthusiasm. She moved to stand beside him at the helm, wrapping an arm around his waist. "I love you, you old sea dog," she said, planting a kiss on his cheek. "Love. You too, my salty sweetheart," he replied with a wink. As the day wore on, the coastline of Tierra del Fuego stretched out before them, a rugged panorama of forests, mountains, and glaciers. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries carried away by the wind. They sailed in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, not just the physical journey from their home in England, but the journey of their lives together. "Do you remember when we first talked about sailing the Horn?" She asked, breaking the silence. Robert chuckled. "How could I forget? We were on our honeymoon, sailing that little dinghy around the Isle of Wight. You said one day we'll sail around the real Cape Horn." "And you said I was mad," Margaret reminded him with a grin. "Well, you were. But it's why I love you." He squeezed her hand. You've always pushed us to dream bigger, go further. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, they prepared for their first night at sea. Robert set about securing the rigging while Margaret went below to prepare a simple dinner. When she returned to the deck with 2 steaming bowls of soup, she found Robert standing at the stern, a pair of binoculars pressed to his eyes. "What is it?" she asked, setting the bowls down. "Not sure," he murmured, still peering through the binoculars. "Thought I saw something in the water. A fin, maybe." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "An orca." Robert lowered the binoculars, shaking his head. "Probably just a dolphin, or my old eyes playing tricks on me." He turned to her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Come on, let's eat before it gets cold." As they sat in the cockpit, eating their soup and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She found herself scanning the water around them, searching for any sign of movement. "Bob," she said hesitantly, "maybe we should take turns keeping watch tonight, just to be safe." Robert studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "All right, if it'll make you feel better. I'll take first watch, you get some rest." Margaret kissed him goodnight and headed below deck to their small cabin. As she lay in her bunk, listening to the creaking of the boat and the lapping of waves against the hull, she tried to convince herself that her fears were unfounded. But as she drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with dark shapes moving, beneath the waves circling ever closer to their bright yellow boat. 3 days into their journey, the Sunflower cut through the choppy waters of the Drake Passage. Margaret stood at the helm, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of steel grey beneath an overcast sky. Despite the chill, in the air Margaret felt a warmth in her chest. They were doing it. They were really sailing around Cape Horn. Robert emerged from below deck, a steaming mug in each hand. "Thought you could use some coffee, love," he said, handing one to Margaret. "Thanks, Bob," she replied, gratefully wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Any signs of the weather clearing? Robert squinted at the sky. "Hard to say. The barometer's holding steady, but out here things can change in an instant." They sipped their coffee in companionable silence, the only sounds the creaking of the rigging and the slap of waves against the hull. Suddenly, Robert straightened, pointing off. "The port bow, Maggie, look, over there!" Margaret followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing but waves. Then a sleek black shape broke the surface, followed by another and another. "Orcas!" she exclaimed, a mixture of excitement and apprehension coloring her voice. Robert hurried below deck, returning moments later with his camera. "This is incredible," he said, snapping photos as the pod of orcas drew closer to the yacht. "I've always wanted to see them in the wild." Margaret watched the magnificent creatures, marveling at their size and grace. She counted at least 6, possibly more beneath the surface. As they approached, she could make out the distinctive white patches on their bodies, stark against the dark water. "They're beautiful," she murmured. Robert lowered his camera, frowning. "Is it just me, or are they coming awfully close?" Margaret's grip tightened on the wheel as she realized he was right. The orcas were no longer simply passing by. They were changing course, heading directly for the Sunflower. "Bob," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "remember what that fisherman in Ushuaia said about the orcas acting strangely?" Robert nodded slowly, his earlier excitement fading. "Maybe we should try to put some distance between us and them." Margaret engaged the engine, hoping the noise might deter the approaching pod. But if anything, it seemed to make them more interested. They picked up speed, easily keeping pace with the yacht. "They're circling us," Robert said, his voice tense. "Look at how they're moving." Margaret saw it too. The orcas were swimming in a coordinated pattern, encircling the Sunflower. Every now and then one would break away, swimming closer to the boat before rejoining the others. "What are they doing?" Margaret asked, a tremor in her voice. Robert shook his head. "I don't know. This isn't normal behavior. It's almost like they're inspecting us." As if in response to his words, one of the larger orcas swam right up to the boat. Margaret gasped as it rolled onto its side, its eye clearly visible above the water. It seemed to be staring directly at them. "Bob," she whispered, "look at its eye. It's so intelligent, almost human." Robert didn't respond. He was staring at something else. "Maggie," he said slowly, "I think I know what they're interested in." "What?" He pointed to the hull. "The yellow paint. Every time they come close, they're looking at the hull." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Could the Orcas really be fixated on the color of their boat? It seemed absurd, and yet a sudden jolt rocked the Sunflower, nearly knocking them off their feet. Margaret clung to the wheel, her heart pounding. "What was that?" she cried. Robert leaned over the side, his face pale. "One of them bumped us. It was gentle, but—" "Maggie, I think we need to get out of here." Margaret nodded, her mouth dry. She pushed the throttle forward, increasing their speed, but the Orcas easily kept pace, continuing their circular pattern around the boat. "It's not working," she said, panic rising in her voice. "What do we do?" Robert ran a hand through his hair, thinking frantically. "Maybe if we change course, head for shallower water?" Margaret nodded, adjusting their heading. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The Orcas fell behind as the Sunflower changed direction, but their relief was short-lived. Within minutes, the pod had caught up again, resuming their unsettling behavior. "We need to radio for help," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice calm. Robert nodded, moving to the radio. He fiddled with the dials, but only static came through. "Damn it," he muttered. "We're too far out, no signal." Another bump rocked the boat, stronger this time. Margaret stumbled, grabbing onto the railing to steady herself. "Bob," she called, her voice shaking. "What if they don't stop? What if they keep doing this?" Robert's face was grim as he rejoined her at the helm. "We'll figure something out, Maggie, we always do." But as the hours wore on, their options seemed to dwindle. The Orcas showed no signs of losing interest. If anything, their behavior was becoming more aggressive. The bumps against the hull were growing stronger, more frequent. As the sun began to set, casting an eerie orange glow across the turbulent sea, Margaret and Robert huddled together in the cockpit. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the wind was picking up. "We can't keep this up all night," Margaret said, her voice hoarse from tension. Robert nodded, his arm tight around her shoulders. "I know, but we don't have much choice. We just have to hope they'll get bored eventually." A particularly hard bump made the whole boat shudder. Margaret buried her face in Robert's shoulder, fighting back tears of fear and exhaustion. "I'm scared." "Bob," she whispered. He kissed the top of her head. "Me too, love, but we're together. Whatever happens, we're together." As darkness fell, the Orcas became even more bold. They could hear them now, their exhalations loud in the night air as they surfaced near the boat. Every now and then, one would breach, sending a spray of icy water over the deck. Margaret and Robert took turns at the helm, each trying to snatch a few minutes of rest while the other kept watch, but sleep was impossible with the constant threat surrounding them. In the early hours of the morning, as a faint light began to appear on the eastern horizon, Robert suddenly straightened. "Maggie," he said urgently. "Look." She followed his gaze. In the dim pre-dawn light, she could see a large male orca positioned directly in front of the boat. As they watched, it rose up, higher and higher. "It's going to breach," Robert said. His voice filled with awe and terror. The orca launched itself out of the water, its massive body silhouetted against the lightening sky. For a moment, it seemed to hang in the air, water cascading off its sleek form. Then it came crashing down mere meters from the bow of the Sunflower. The impact sent a massive wave over the deck, drenching Margaret and Robert. As they sputtered and wiped the salt water from their eyes, they realized something had changed. The constant bumping had stopped. The sounds of the Orcas surfacing had faded. Cautiously, they peered over the side of the boat. The water around them was empty, the sea. Pod had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Margaret and Robert stood in stunned silence, scarcely daring to believe it was over. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant pinks and golds, Margaret turned to her husband. "Do you think they're really gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert nodded slowly. "I think so." "But Maggie—" "What?" He met her eyes, his expression grave. "I think this is only the beginning." As they stood there watching the sun rise over the now calm sea, both knew that their dream voyage had turned into something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The Sunflower cut through the waves, its yellow hull gleaming in the midday sun. Margaret stood at the helm, her knuckles white as she gripped the wheel. Robert sat nearby, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The encounter with the Orcas had left them both on edge, despite the hours that had passed since the pod's disappearance. "Anything?" Margaret asked, breaking the tense silence. Robert shook his head. "Nothing yet. But that doesn't mean they're not out there." Margaret nodded, trying to ignore the knot of fear in her stomach. They had debated turning back, but the nearest port was now as far away as their destination. They were committed to their course. "For better or worse. I've been thinking," Robert said, his voice low, "about what that fisherman said in Ushuaia, about the Orcas acting strangely. What about it? Well, what if it wasn't just talk? What if something's really changed out here?" Margaret frowned. "Like what? Pollution? Climate change?" Robert shrugged. "Could be. Or maybe it's something we don't understand yet. Either way, I think we need to be prepared for the possibility that they'll come back." As if summoned by his words, a dark shape broke the surface of the water off the port side. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the distinctive dorsal fin of an orca. "Bob," she whispered, nodding towards the fin. Robert saw it too. His face paled. "Here we go again," he muttered. Within minutes, the Sunflower was once again surrounded by the pod of orcas. They moved with the same eerie coordination as before, circling the yacht with what seemed like purposeful intent. "What do we do?" Margaret asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Robert thought for a moment. "Let's try changing course. So again, head east towards the coast." Margaret nodded, adjusting their heading. The yacht responded smoothly, but the orcas easily kept pace, maintaining their circular formation around the boat. "It's not working," Margaret said, her voice tight with frustration and fear. Robert ran a hand through his hair. "Okay, new plan. Let's try to distract them." He disappeared below deck, returning moments later with a bucket of fish they had caught the day before. Without hesitation, he began tossing the fish overboard one by one. "Come on, you big bastards," he muttered. "Leave us alone and get your lunch." But the orcas ignored the fish completely, their focus remaining fixed on the Sunflower. As Robert threw the last fish, a large male orca swam right up to the boat. It rolled onto its side, its eye clearly visible above the water, staring directly at them. Margaret shuddered. "It's like they're studying us," she said. Robert nodded grimly. "I think they are, and I don't like what that might mean." A sudden jolt rocked the boat. Margaret stumbled, nearly losing her grip on the wheel. "They're starting again," she said, her voice tight with fear. Robert steadied himself against the railing. "We need to radio for help." He moved to the communication equipment, fiddling with dials and switches. Static filled the air, punctuated by occasional bursts of unintelligible speech. "Mayday, mayday," Robert called into the radio. "This is the yacht Sunflower. We are approximately 100 nautical miles southwest of Cape Horn. We are under attack by a pod of orcas. Request immediate assistance." He repeated the message several times, but there was no response. Just more static. Damn it. Robert slammed his fist against the console in frustration. Another bump, harder this time, sent a shudder through the Sunflower's frame. Margaret fought to keep the boat steady. "Bob," she called, her voice strained. "I think they're getting more aggressive." Robert rejoined her at the helm, his face grim. "I think you're right. We need to figure out a way to deter them." "How?" "We've tried everything." Robert's eyes darted around the deck, searching for inspiration. His gaze landed on the boat's horn. "Sound," he said suddenly. "Orcas use echolocation. Maybe we can disrupt them with noise." He lunged for the horn, pressing it hard. A loud, sustained blast cut through the air. For a moment, the bumping stopped. Margaret dared to hope it had worked. But then an orca breached right next to the boat, sending a spray of icy water over them. The bumping resumed, more forceful than ever. "It's not working," Margaret shouted over the noise of the horn and the increasingly rough sea. Robert released the horn, frustration etched on his face. "We need to think of something else, fast." As if in response to his words, a particularly hard impact rocked the Sunflower. Margaret lost her footing, crashing hard against the railing. She cried out in pain as her arm twisted beneath her. "Maggie!" Robert was at her side in an instant, helping her up. "Are you all right?" Margaret winced, cradling her arm. "I think it's sprained," she said through gritted teeth. Robert's face hardened. "That's it," he growled. "We're getting out of here now." He took the wheel, pushing the throttle forward. The Sunflower's engine roared to life, propelling them forward with increased speed. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The Orcas fell, behind as the yacht surged ahead. But their relief was short-lived. Within minutes, the pod had caught up, easily matching the boat's speed. "It's no use," Margaret said, her voice heavy with despair. "We can't outrun them." Robert's knuckles were white on the wheel. "We have to keep trying," he said. "We can't give up." Hours passed, the sun arcing across the sky as the Sunflower fled. Across the turbulent waters, the Orcas showed no signs of tiring, their relentless pursuit never faltering. As evening approached, storm clouds began to gather on the horizon. The wind picked up, whipping the waves into a frenzy. "Storm's coming," Robert said grimly. "We need to find shelter." Margaret nodded, wincing as she tried to move her injured arm. "There's a small island marked on the charts about 20 miles southeast of here. It might offer some protection." Robert adjusted their course, aiming for the island. The Orcas followed, their movements becoming more erratic as the sea grew rougher. Night fell as they approached the island, its rocky shores barely visible in the gloom. Rain began to fall, first a light drizzle, then a heavy downpour that reduced visibility to almost nothing. "I can't see a thing," Robert shouted over the howling wind. Margaret squinted through the rain, trying to make out the shoreline. "We're too close," she cried. "We need to turn back." But before Robert could respond, a massive wave slammed into the Sunflower. The yacht lurched violently, nearly capsizing. Margaret screamed as she was thrown across the deck, slamming hard against the cabin wall. Robert fought with the wheel, struggling to keep the boat upright. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of a large, dark shape in the water, an orca positioning itself directly in their path. "Hang on!" he yelled, but his words were lost in the roar of the storm. The Sunflower hit the orca with a sickening crunch. The impact sent Robert flying, his head striking the railing with a sharp crack. He crumpled to the deck, motionless. "Bob!" Margaret crawled towards him, fighting against the pitching of the boat and the pain in her arm. "Bob, wake up!" But Robert didn't stir. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, mixing with the rain on the deck. Margaret looked up, terror gripping her heart as she saw the rocky shoreline looming before them. The Sunflower, out of control, was headed straight for the jagged rocks. With a desperate cry, she lunged for the wheel. Her injured arm screamed in protest as she fought to turn the yacht away from the deadly shore. For a moment, it seemed hopeless. The Sunflower continued its inexorable path towards destruction. But then, slowly, agonizingly, the boat began to turn. Margaret sobbed with relief as they narrowly missed the rocks, the hull scraping against stone with a sound like tearing metal. They weren't safe yet, but they had avoided immediate disaster. As the Sunflower limped into the lee of the island, the worst of the storm's fury abated. The Orcas, perhaps deterred by the shallow water, had fallen back. Margaret engaged the anchor, praying it would hold in the turbulent sea. Then she turned her attention to Robert, still unconscious on the deck. As she cradled his head in her lap, tears mixing with the rain on her face, Margaret realized that their ordeal was far from over. They were injured, their boat was damaged, and somewhere out in the darkness the Orcas were waiting. The night stretched ahead, long and terrifying, with no guarantee of what the dawn would bring. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, illuminating the battered Sunflower as it bobbed uneasily in the choppy waters. Margaret sat slumped against the cabin wall, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. Beside her, Robert stirred, groaning as he regained consciousness. "Bob." Margaret's voice was hoarse with exhaustion and worry. "Can you hear me?" Robert's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then settling on Margaret's face. "Maggie, what happened?" "We hit something," Margaret explained, helping him sit up slowly. "An orca, I think." "You were knocked out." Robert winced, touching the makeshift bandage Margaret had wrapped around his head. "The boat, the Orcas. We're anchored in the lee of an island," Margaret said. "The boat's damaged but holding together. And the Orcas—" She shuddered. "They're out there somewhere. I haven't seen them since the storm, but I can feel them." "Watching." Robert nodded grimly, then immediately regretted the movement as pain lanced through his skull. We need to assess the damage, see if we can make repairs. Together, they slowly made their way around the yacht. The bright yellow paint was scraped and scarred, with a worrying dent in the hull where they had struck the Orca. The rudder was bent, making steering difficult, and the radio was waterlogged and useless. "It's not good, Maggie," Robert said, his face grim. "We can patch the hull, maybe straighten the rudder enough to limp along, but without the radio, we're on our own," Margaret finished, her voice barely above a whisper. As if in response to her words, a sleek black dorsal fin broke the surface of the water some distance from the boat. Then another, and another. "They're back," Robert said, his voice tight with fear and anger. Margaret gripped the railing, her knuckles white. "What do they want from us?" Robert shook his head, wincing at the movement. "I don't know, love. But we can't stay here forever. We need to make a run for it." They worked feverishly, patching the hull as best they could and jury-rigging the rudder. All the while, the Orcas circled lazily, always visible but never approaching too close. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Robert started the engine. It sputtered and coughed but finally roared to life. "Ready?" he asked Margaret, who nodded. Tersely, they pulled up the anchor and slowly moved away from the island's protective embrace. For a moment it seemed the Orcas might let them go, but as soon as they reached deeper water, the pod sprang into action. "Here they come," Margaret said, her voice tight with fear. The Orcas moved with incredible speed and coordination, quickly surrounding the Sunflower. This time there was no gentle bumping, no curious inspection. The first impact nearly knocked Margaret off her feet. "Hold on!" Robert shouted, fighting with the wheel, as another Orca rammed the boat from the other side. The attacks came relentlessly, each impact more violent than the last. The sound of cracking fiberglass filled the air as the hull began to give way. "We're taking on water," Margaret cried, seeing the ocean starting to seep in through new cracks. Robert's face was a mask of determination. "We need to lighten the load, throw everything overboard." They worked frantically, tossing supplies, equipment, anything not absolutely essential into the churning sea. But it wasn't enough. The water continued to rise inside the boat and the Orcas showed no signs of letting up. A particularly vicious hit sent Robert stumbling. He fell hard, crying out in pain as his injured head struck the deck. "Bob!" Margaret rushed to his side, helping him up. Blood was seeping through his bandage and his eyes were unfocused. "Maggie," he mumbled, "you need to get to the life raft. Now." "Not without you," she insisted, tears streaming down her face. Another impact rocked the boat. The engine sputtered and died. "Go!" Robert shouted, pushing her towards the life raft. "I'll be right behind you." Margaret hesitated for a split second, then ran to deploy the life raft. As it inflated, she turned back to see Robert struggling to gather their emergency supplies. "Bob, hurry!" she screamed over the noise of the attacking Orcas and the groaning of the dying Sunflower. Robert staggered towards her, arms full of supplies. But before he could reach the life raft, a massive Orca breached right next to the boat. The impact sent a wave crashing over the deck, sweeping Robert off his feet. Margaret watched in horror as her husband disappeared beneath the churning waves. "Bob!" she screamed, ready to dive in after him. But then he surfaced, gasping and flailing. "Maggie, help!" Without hesitation, Margaret plunged into the icy water. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. But she forced herself to swim, fighting against the waves to reach Robert. Around them, the Orcas continued their assault on the Sunflower, paying no attention to the humans in the water. Margaret reached Robert, wrapping her arm around his chest and kicking hard to keep them both afloat. "The raft," Robert gasped, spitting out seawater. "We need to get to the raft." Together they struggled towards the life raft, which was being tossed about by the turbulent sea. After what felt like an eternity, Margaret managed to grab hold of the raft's edge. With the last of her strength, she heaved Robert in, then pulled herself up after him. They lay in the bottom of the raft, gasping and shivering, as the Sunflower gave one final groan and slipped beneath the waves. The Orcas, their target gone, began to circle the small life raft. "Why?" Margaret sobbed, clinging to Robert. "Why are they doing this?" Robert shook his head, his eyes fixed on the circling predators. "I don't know, love. I just don't know." Hours passed. The sun beat down mercilessly as Margaret and Robert huddled, in their tiny raft, surrounded by some of the ocean's most intelligent and deadly hunters. They rationed their meager supplies, knowing they had to make them last as long as possible. The orcas never left. They circled continuously, sometimes coming close enough that Margaret could see their eyes watching her. It was deeply unsettling, like being stalked by something that was not just a predator, but intelligent, calculating. As night fell, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold, Margaret turned to Robert. "Do you think anyone's looking for us?" Robert nodded, though his eyes were filled with doubt. "The Chilean Navy knows our general route. When we don't check in, they'll come looking. But will they find us in time?" Margaret whispered. Robert didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew their chances were slim. The night seemed endless. Neither of them slept, too afraid of what the orcas might do if they let their guard down. They talked in low voices, reminiscing about happier times, the adventures they'd had, the life they'd built together. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret gasped. "Bob, look!" On the horizon, barely visible, was the unmistakable silhouette of a ship. "Hey!" Robert shouted, waving his arms frantically. "Over here, help!" Margaret joined in, screaming and waving until her throat was raw. But the ship was so far away. Would they be seen? Then, as if sensing their prey might escape, the orcas began to move. They swam in tight circles around the life raft, creating waves that threatened to capsize it. "No!" Margaret cried, clinging to the sides of the raft. "Please, no!" Robert held onto her tightly, his eyes never leaving the approaching ship. "Just a little longer," he muttered. "Please, just a little longer." The orcas' circling became tighter, more frenzied. Water sloshed into the raft. Margaret and Robert bailed frantically, knowing that if the raft filled, they were doomed. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, a deafening sound cut through the air. The ship's horn announcing that they'd been spotted. As suddenly as they had appeared, the orcas vanished. One moment they were there, creating a maelstrom around the tiny raft, and the next they were gone, disappearing into the depths without a trace. Margaret and Robert clung to each other, scarcely daring to believe it was over. As the ship drew nearer, its name became visible. Esperanza. Hope. As the crew of the Esperanza pulled them to safety, Margaret looked out at the now calm sea. There was no sign of the orcas, no evidence of the terror they'd endured, but she knew she would never forget. The ocean, which had once been a source of joy and adventure, would forever hold a deeper, darker mystery. Robert squeezed her hand, as if reading her thoughts. "We're alive, Maggie," he said softly. "We survived." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. They had survived, yes. But as the Esperanza turned towards home, she knew their ordeal was far from over. The memory of those intelligent, relentless predators would haunt her dreams for years to come. The Esperanza's engine thrummed steadily as it cut through the waves, heading back to port. Margaret sat wrapped in a thick blanket on the deck, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Robert sat beside her, his bandaged head a stark reminder of their ordeal. "How are you feeling?" Margaret asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for hours. Robert turned to her, his eyes haunted. "Physically, I'll heal. But—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I know," Margaret whispered, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "I can't stop seeing them. Every time I close my eyes, they're there." A crew member approached, carrying 2 steaming mugs. "Thought you could use some coffee," he said, handing them over. "Thank you," Robert said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "And thank you for finding us. If you hadn't—" The crew member, a weathered man in his 50s, nodded grimly. "We've been hearing strange reports lately. Orcas acting aggressive, attacking boats. But nothing like what you described." Margaret shuddered. "It was like they were hunting us, deliberately." The crew member frowned. "That's not normal orca behavior. They're intelligent, sure, but they don't typically attack humans." "These weren't typical orcas," Robert said, his voice hard. "There was something different about them." As the crew member walked away, Margaret turned to Robert. "What do you think he meant about strange reports?" Robert shook his head. "I don't know, but I have a feeling we're not the only ones who've had encounters like this." As they approached the port of Punta Arenas, they could see a crowd gathered on the docks. News of their rescue had spread quickly. "I don't know if I can face all those people," Margaret said, her voice trembling. Robert squeezed her hand. "We'll do it together, just like we've done everything else." As they disembarked, they were immediately surrounded by reporters, their cameras flashing and questions flying. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, can you tell us what happened? Is it true you were attacked by killer whales? How did you survive for so long at sea?" Robert held up his hands, trying to quiet the crowd. "Please, my wife and I have been through a terrible ordeal. We need rest and medical attention. We'll answer your questions later." As they pushed through the crowd, a man in a crisp uniform approached them. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, I'm Captain Alejandro Ruiz of the Chilean Navy. We've been very concerned about you. If you're feeling up to it, we'd like to debrief you on what happened." Margaret and Robert exchanged glances. "Can it wait?" Margaret asked. "We're exhausted." Captain Ruiz's face was sympathetic but firm. "I understand, but time is of the essence. We need to know exactly what happened out there. Other lives may depend on it." Reluctantly, they agreed. The captain led them to a small, private room in the harbour master's office. As they sat down, Margaret noticed a map on the wall with several red pins stuck into it. "Before we begin," Captain Ruiz said, "I want you to know that you're not alone. We've had several reports of unusual orca behavior in the past few months." He gestured to the map. "Each of these pins represents an incident. Boats damaged, crews terrified. But your encounter, it's the most severe we've seen yet." Robert leaned forward. "What's causing this? Why are the orcas behaving this way?" Captain Ruiz sighed. "We don't know for certain. There are theories. Changes in ocean temperature affecting their prey. Increased shipping noise disturbing their communication. Some even suggest military sonar tests might be involved. But the truth is, we're in uncharted territory." For the next few hours, Margaret and Robert recounted their harrowing experience in detail. Captain Ruiz listened intently, his frown deepening, as they described the orcas' coordinated attacks and seemingly deliberate behavior. When they finished, the captain was silent for a long moment. "This is unprecedented," he finally said. "The level of coordination you described, the sustained nature of the attack, it's unlike anything we've encountered before." "What happens now?" Margaret asked, her voice small. "We'll continue to investigate," Captain Ruiz said. "We're working with marine biologists, trying to understand what's driving this behavior. In the meantime, we're issuing warnings to all vessels in the area." As they left the harbour master's office, the sun was setting, painting the sky in vivid oranges and reds. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now, it just reminded Margaret of the long, terrifying nights at sea. "I don't think I'll ever be able to look at the ocean the same way again," she murmured. Robert put his arm around her. "We'll get through this, Maggie. We survived out there. We'll survive this too." But as they made their way to the hotel where they'd be staying, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal was far from over. The memory of those intelligent eyes watching her, the coordinated attacks, the relentless pursuit. It all swirled in her mind, refusing to let go. That night, as they lay in bed, neither of them could sleep. The soft bed felt strange after days in the life raft, and every time Margaret closed her eyes, she saw sleek black shapes moving through dark water. "Bob?" she whispered into the darkness. "Yeah. Do you think we'll ever know why? Why they targeted us?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know, Maggie, but I intend to find out." The next morning, they were awakened by a knock at their door. It was Captain Ruiz, his face grave. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, "but there's been another incident. A fishing boat was attacked last night, not far from where we found you. The crew managed to make it to shore, but..." "But what?" Robert pressed. "But they're saying the orcas seem to be looking for something. They kept circling the boat, as if searching for a specific target." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "You don't think..." Captain Ruiz nodded grimly. "We can't be certain, but given what you told us about your experience, we have to consider the possibility that these orcas are hunting, and that they might have a specific target in mind." Robert stood up straighter. "What can we do to help?" The captain looked surprised. "Mr. Thornton, after what you've been through, no one would expect you to..." "No," Robert interrupted. "We need to understand what's happening. If there's any way we can help prevent others from going through what we did, We have to try. Margaret nodded, standing beside her husband. Despite her fear, she knew he was right. They couldn't just walk. Away from this, Captain Ruiz studied them for a moment, then nodded. Very well. We're assembling a team. Marine biologists, naval experts, even a cetacean behaviorist. We'd like you to join us, to share your first-hand experience. As they followed Captain Ruiz out of the hotel, Margaret caught a glimpse of the ocean in the distance. Its surface was calm, beautiful even, hiding the dangers that lurked beneath. She shuddered, remembering the relentless pursuit, the intelligent malice in those dark eyes. But as she looked at Robert, saw the determination. In his face, she felt a spark of hope. They had survived the attack. Now it was time to understand it, to prevent it from happening to others. Whatever mysteries the ocean held, whatever had driven those orcas to such unprecedented behavior, they would face it together. As they climbed into the captain's car, Margaret took one last look at the sea. Somewhere out there she knew the orcas were waiting, but this time they would be ready. This time they would uncover the truth behind the shadows in the deep. The research vessel Oceanic Explorer rocked gently in the choppy waters off the coast of Chile. Margaret stood on the deck, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and deep purples. It would have been beautiful, if not for the knot of fear in her stomach. Robert emerged from below deck, a steaming mug of coffee in each hand. He handed one to Margaret, his eyes filled with concern. "How are you holding up?" Margaret took a sip, letting the warmth seep into her bones. "I'm okay. It's just being out here again. Every shadow in the water makes my heart race." Robert nodded, understanding etched on his face. "I know, but we're safer here. The Oceanic Explorer is bigger, sturdier, and we're not alone this time." As if on cue, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead marine biologist on the expedition, joined them at the railing. "Any sightings yet?" Margaret shook her head. "Nothing. It's almost too quiet." Dr. Rodriguez frowned, her dark eyes scanning the water. "The hydrophones have been picking up increased orca vocalizations in the area. They're out there. We just can't see them yet." The thought sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. She remembered all too well the feeling of being watched, hunted. "What do you think we'll find?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Rodriguez sighed, running a hand through her salt-stiffened hair. "Honestly, I don't know. In all my years studying marine mammals, I've never encountered behavior like what you described. It goes against everything we know about orca social structures and hunting patterns." Robert leaned in, his voice low. "Could it be some sort of, I don't know, mass psychosis? A reaction to environmental changes?" "It's possible," Dr. Rodriguez admitted. "We're seeing unprecedented changes in ocean temperatures, acidity levels, prey distribution. But to cause such a dramatic shift in behavior, and in such a localized area, it's baffling." As night fell, the deck lights of the Oceanic Explorer cast an eerie glow on the surrounding water. The research team worked tirelessly, monitoring instruments, analyzing data, and keeping a vigilant watch on the sea. Margaret and Robert took shifts sleeping, neither wanting to leave the other alone on deck. As Margaret stared into the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. In the early hours of the morning, a shout from one of the crew members jolted everyone to attention. "Contact! Portside, about 500 meters out." Margaret rushed to the railing, her heart pounding. In the dim light of dawn, she could make out the distinctive dorsal fins of orcas cutting through the water. Her breath caught in her throat as memories of their attack flooded back. Robert was at her side in an instant, his arm protective around her shoulders. "It's okay," he murmured. "We're safe here." Dr. Rodriguez joined them, binoculars in hand. "It's a pod of about 6 individuals," she reported. "They seem to be circling us." The tension on deck was palpable as everyone watched the orcas. Their movements were eerily familiar to Margaret, the same coordinated patterns they had used to attack the Sunflower. "They're hunting," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Dr. Rodriguez looked at her sharply. "What makes you say that?" "The way they're moving," Robert explained, his eyes never leaving the water. "It's exactly how they behaved before they attacked our yacht." The marine biologist's face paled. She turned to the captain, who had joined them on deck. "We need to move now." But before the captain could respond, the Orcas struck. The impact rocked the Oceanic Explorer, sending people stumbling across the deck. Margaret clung to the railing, her knuckles white. "Everyone inside," the captain bellowed. "Secure all hatches." As they scrambled to obey, Margaret caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. One of the Orcas had rolled onto its side, its eye clearly visible above the water. It was staring directly at her, with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Inside the bridge, chaos reigned. The captain barked orders as crew members frantically worked to stabilize the ship and assess the damage. "Hull integrity is holding," someone reported, "but they've damaged one of the propellers." Another impact shook the ship. Margaret stumbled, falling against Robert. He held her tight, his face a mask of determination and fear. "Doctor," Rodriguez was at a console, her fingers flying over the keys. "I'm recording everything," she said, her voice tense. "The vocalizations, the attack patterns. We need to document this." Hours passed in a blur of fear and adrenaline. The Orcas continued. Their assault, their attacks growing more coordinated and vicious. The Oceanic Explorer groaned under the onslaught, its hull beginning to buckle in places. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the turbulent sea, the captain made a difficult decision. "We can't stay out here," he announced grimly. "We're going to make a run for the coast." The journey back to shore was a nightmare. The Orcas pursued them relentlessly, striking at the ship's weakened hull and damaged propeller. Every impact sent shudders through the vessel, and Margaret found herself praying as she had never prayed before. Finally, mercifully, the coast came into view. As they approached shallower waters, the attacks began to lessen. The Orcas, seemingly frustrated by their prey's escape, gradually fell back. As the Oceanic Explorer limped into port, cheers erupted from the battered crew. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to celebrate. The memory of that Orca's eye staring at her with such unnerving intelligence haunted her. In the days that followed, as the research team pored over the data they had collected, Margaret and Robert found themselves at the center of a media storm. Their story, combined with the dramatic footage from the Oceanic Explorer's encounter, had captured the world's attention. Theories abounded. Some claimed it was a natural response to changing ocean conditions. Others suggested more sinister explanations, military experiments gone wrong, or even extraterrestrial influence. Through it all, Margaret and Robert tried to maintain their privacy, focusing on helping the scientists understand what had happened. One evening, as they sat in their hotel room watching yet another news report about the killer whale crisis, Robert turned to Margaret with a determined look in his eyes. "We can't just sit here and watch," he said. "We need to do something." Margaret nodded slowly. "But what? We're not scientists or marine experts." "No," Robert agreed, "but we have something. They don't. First-hand experience. We know what it's like to be out there, to be hunted by them. Maybe that's what's needed to find a solution." Margaret felt a mix of fear and resolve settle in her chest. "You're right," she said softly. "We can't let what happened to us happen to anyone else." As they began to formulate a plan, to share their story more widely, to push for increased research funding, to advocate for better protections for both humans and marine life, Margaret found herself thinking again of that Orca's eye. There had been something in that gaze, not just intelligence but a kind of desperate fury, as if it was trying to communicate something of vital importance. "What if," she said slowly, the idea taking shape as she spoke, "what if they're not just attacking randomly? What if they're trying to tell us something?" Robert looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I don't know exactly," Margaret admitted. "But think about it. Orcas are incredibly intelligent. They have complex social structures. They can problem solve. What if this behavior is their way of sending a message?" As far-fetched as it sounded, the idea took hold. In the weeks that followed, as they worked with researchers and advocated for more studies, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something profound. Something that could change not just their understanding of Orcas, but of humanity's relationship with the ocean itself. The truth, they realized, was out there in the deep, dark waters. And somehow, someway, they were going to find it. The Orcas had started this. Now it was up to them to finish it, to uncover the mystery, to bridge the gap between two species, and perhaps in doing so, to heal the wounds inflicted on both sides. Margaret stood on the beach one evening, watching the sun set over the ocean that had nearly claimed their lives. She felt a strange mix of fear and hope. Whatever lay ahead, whatever secrets the Orcas held, she and Robert would face it together, just as they always had. The sea, once a source of joy and adventure, now held a deeper, darker mystery. But in that mystery lay the possibility of understanding, of connection, and as the last rays of sunlight glinted off the waves, Margaret made a silent promise to the Orcas, to the ocean, to herself. They would solve this puzzle, no matter the cost. The hunt had begun anew, but this time they were the ones seeking answers. Margaret stood at the bow of the research vessel, her eyes scanning the horizon. The salt spray stung her face, but she barely noticed. Her entire being was focused on the water, searching for any sign of movement beneath the surface. Anything? Robert's voice came from behind her. She shook her head, not taking her eyes off the sea. Nothing yet. But they're out there. I can feel it. Robert joined her at the railing, his hand finding hers. The warmth of his touch was comforting against the chill ocean breeze. Dr. Rodriguez says the hydrophones are picking up increased activity. They're definitely in the area. Margaret nodded, her jaw set with determination. It had been 3 months since their last encounter with the Orcas. 3 months of preparation, research, and steeling themselves for this moment. They were back on the water, but this time they were the ones doing the hunting. The research vessel, aptly named the Pursuit, was equipped with the latest in marine research technology. Sonar, underwater drones, and a team of the world's leading marine biologists and orca experts. But its most valuable asset, according to Dr. Rodriguez, was the couple standing at its bow. Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, Dr. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the ship's intercom. We need you in the lab, we've got something. They hurried below deck, entering the state-of-the-art research lab that took up most of the ship's interior. Screens lined the walls, displaying various readouts and underwater footage. In the center of the room, a large holographic display showed a 3D map of the surrounding ocean. Dr. Rodriguez stood before the display, her face illuminated by its blue glow. We've detected a pod, she said as Margaret and Robert entered, about 3 miles northwest of our position. They're moving fast. How many? Robert asked, studying the holographic blips that represented the Orcas. We count 7, Dr. Rodriguez replied. A typical family unit, but their behavior... She trailed off, frowning at the display. What about it? Margaret pressed, feeling her heart rate increase. Dr. Rodriguez zoomed in on the holographic pod. They're moving in a hunting formation, but there's no prey in the area. At least none that we can detect. It's as if they're searching. For something, Margaret finished, exchanging a knowing look with Robert. Dr. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Exactly. And I have a feeling I know what, or who, they're looking for. The implication hung heavy in the air. Ever since Margaret had proposed her theory that the Orcas were trying to communicate something, the scientific community had been divided. Some dismissed it as the traumatized ramblings of attack survivors. Others saw it as a fascinating possibility, a potential breakthrough in interspecies communication. We need to get closer, Robert said, his voice firm. If they are looking for us, we need to be there. Dr. Rodriguez hesitated. Mr. Thornton, I understand your eagerness, but we need to prioritize safety. These Orcas have already demonstrated unprecedented aggression. With all due respect, Doctor, Margaret interjected, Robert and I have more experience with these particular Orcas than anyone else. We know the risks, but we also know that this might be our only chance to understand what's happening. The scientist looked between them, conflict clear on her face. Finally, she nodded. All right, but we approach with extreme caution. At the first sign of aggression, we pull back. Agreed? Margaret and Robert nodded in unison. As Dr. Rodriguez relayed orders to the captain, the couple shared a look of mingled fear and determination. They were about to face their nightmares head-on. As the Pursuit changed course to intercept the pod, tension on the ship ratcheted up. Crew members double-checked safety equipment, and researchers hurriedly calibrated their instruments. Margaret and Robert returned to the deck, unable to bear the confines of the lab. The sea was choppy, white-capped waves breaking against the ship's hull. The sky had darkened, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. It was as if nature itself was setting the stage for the confrontation to come. There! Robert suddenly shouted, pointing off the port bow. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. A sleek black dorsal fin had broken the surface, followed by another and another. The pod had arrived. The ship's engines cut to a low rumble as they drew closer to the Orcas. Margaret counted 7, just as Dr. Rodriguez had said. They swam in a tight formation, their movements perfectly synchronized. "They're so beautiful," Margaret murmured, momentarily forgetting her fear in the face of their grace and power. As if in response to her words, one of the Orcas suddenly breached, its massive body arcing through the air before crashing back into the sea. The impact sent a spray of water over the deck, drenching Margaret and Robert. "I think they know we're here," Robert said, wiping salt water from his eyes. No sooner had the words left his mouth than the Orcas changed formation. They began to circle the ship, their movements reminiscent of the attack on the Sunflower. Margaret felt her heart racing, old terror threatening to overwhelm her. "Stay calm," Robert said, as much to himself as to her. "We're safe here. Remember why we're doing this." Margaret nodded, taking a deep breath. They were here to understand, to bridge the gap between species. She couldn't let fear control her now. Suddenly, a large male orca broke from the circle. It swam directly towards the ship, its speed alarming. Margaret tensed, preparing for an impact, but instead of ramming the hull, the orca came to a stop mere meters from the ship. Then, slowly, deliberately, it rolled onto its side. Margaret gasped. The orca's eye was above the water, staring directly at her. It was the same intelligent, almost human gaze that had haunted her dreams for months. "Bob," she whispered, gripping her husband's arm. "Do you see that?" Robert nodded, his face pale. "It's looking right at us." Just like before. For a long moment, time seemed to stand still. Margaret stared into the orca's eye, and it stared back. She had the overwhelming sensation that it was trying to tell her something, if only she could understand. Then, without warning, the orca slapped its tail against the water. The sound was like a gunshot, making everyone on deck jump. It repeated the action again and again, in a distinct pattern. "It's not random," Robert said, his scientific mind kicking into gear. "That's a deliberate sequence." Dr. Rodriguez appeared on deck, her face a mix of awe and excitement. "We're recording everything," she said. This is unprecedented behavior." As they watched, the other orcas joined in. They began to vocalize, their haunting calls filling the air. It was a cacophony of sound, yet there was a rhythm to it, a structure that hinted at meaning. "It's a language," Margaret breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical force. "They're speaking to us." For hours, the orcas continued their display. They breached, tail-slapped, and vocalized in complex patterns. The research team worked feverishly, recording every sound and movement. Margaret and Robert remained on deck, transfixed by the performance. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the sea, the orcas' behavior changed. They ceased their vocalizations and began to swim in tight circles around the ship. Then, one by one, they dove beneath the waves. The large male, the one that had made eye contact with Margaret, was the last to go. It raised its head above the water one final time, its gaze locking with hers. Then, with a flick of its powerful tail, it disappeared into the depths. A hush fell over the ship. The sea, which had been alive with activity moments before, was now eerily calm. Margaret leaned against Robert, emotionally and physically exhausted. "What do you think it means?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert shook his head, his arms tightening around her. "I don't know, Maggie, but I think we've just witnessed something extraordinary, something that could change everything we thought we knew about. Orcas, about animal intelligence, about our relationship with the ocean itself." As they stood there, watching the last light fade from the sky, Margaret felt a profound sense of purpose settle over her. They had come seeking answers, and while they hadn't found them all, they had made a breakthrough. The Orcas had spoken. Now it was up to them to decipher the message. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But as the pursuit turned back towards land, carrying with it data that would keep scientists busy for years to come, Margaret knew one thing for certain. The Orcas' message, whatever it was urgent. And somehow, someway, she and Robert were going to figure it out. The fate of two species might just depend on it. The halls of the Marine Research Institute buzzed with activity as Margaret and Robert made their way to the main conference room. It had been 2 weeks since their encounter with the Orcas, and the scientific community was still reeling from the implications of what they had witnessed. "Ready for this?" Robert asked, giving Margaret's hand a reassuring squeeze. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." They entered the conference room to find it already packed with researchers, marine biologists, and government officials. Dr. Rodriguez stood at the front, her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with excitement. Mr. and Mrs. Thornton," she said, gesturing for them to join her. "We were just about to begin." As they took their seats, Dr. Rodriguez addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you're all aware, 2 weeks ago we witnessed something unprecedented. A pod of orcas engaged in what can only be described as an attempt at communication with our research vessel." She clicked a button and the room darkened as a large screen came to life. Footage from their encounter played out, showing the orcas' complex behaviors and vocalizations. "We've been analyzing the data non-stop since our return," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "And while we're far from understanding everything, we've made some startling discoveries." She nodded to a colleague who stood up. "Dr. Chen, our linguistics expert, will explain." Dr. Chen, a petite woman with sharp eyes, took center stage. "What we're seeing here isn't random. There's a clear structure to both the vocalizations and the physical displays. It bears similarities to human language in terms of its complexity and apparent rule-based nature." A murmur ran through the room. Margaret leaned forward, her heart racing. "Are you saying," she asked, her voice trembling slightly, "that the Orcas have a language?" Dr. Chen nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying, Mrs. Thornton. A sophisticated one at that. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of understanding it, but the implications are, well, revolutionary." The room erupted in discussion. Margaret turned to Robert, her eyes wide. "Bob, do you realize what this means?" He nodded, his face a mix of awe and concern. "It means we've been underestimating them. All this time, we thought we were the only ones capable of complex communication." Dr. Rodriguez raised her hands, calling for quiet. "There's more," she said, her voice grave. "We've detected a pattern in the Orcas' behavior. Their aggression towards boats isn't random. They're targeting vessels with certain characteristics, primarily those involved in commercial fishing or oil exploration." A government official stood up, his face flushed. "Are you suggesting these animals are deliberately attacking our industries?" "That's exactly what we're suggesting," Dr. Rodriguez replied firmly. "And given what we now know about their intelligence and communication abilities, we have to consider the possibility that there's a reason behind it." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered the desperate fury she had seen in the Orca's eye during their first encounter. "They're trying to tell us something," she said, her voice carrying in the sudden hush. "Something urgent." All eyes turned to her. Dr. Rodriguez nodded encouragingly. "Go on, Mrs. Thornton. You've had more direct contact with these orcas than anyone." Margaret stood, her legs shaky, but her voice strong. "Think about it. These are highly intelligent creatures with a complex language. They've lived in the oceans for millions of years. What if they're seeing something we're not? Something happening to their home, to the oceans?" Robert stood beside her, picking up her train of thought. "Climate change, overfishing, pollution. We know these are having devastating effects on marine ecosystems. What if the orcas are trying to warn us, to stop us before it's too late?" The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Then, gradually, voices began to rise. Some were skeptical, others excited by the possibility. The government official who had spoken earlier scoffed. "This is preposterous," he said. "You're anthropomorphizing these animals. They're acting on instinct, nothing more." Dr. Chen shook her head. With all due respect, sir, that's an outdated view. The complexity we're seeing in their communication goes far beyond instinct. We have to consider the possibility that the Thorntons are right. As the debate raged on, Margaret felt a sense of urgency growing within her. She turned to Dr. Rodriguez. "We need to go back out there," she said. "We need to try to communicate with them directly." Dr. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "I agree. But how? We're only just beginning to understand their language." Robert cleared his throat. "What if we don't need to understand every word? What if we just need to show them we're listening?" All eyes turned to him. He continued, his voice gaining strength. "We know they're targeting certain types of ships. What if we create a vessel that's the opposite of everything they seem to? Hate? Something that shows we're there to listen, not to exploit?" Dr. Rodriguez's eyes lit up. "A ship designed specifically for communication attempts. No fishing gear, no drilling equipment, just pure research technology and, what? Some kind of visual signal?" Margaret nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, and we could use underwater speakers to play back their own vocalizations, show them we've been paying attention." The room buzzed with excitement as the idea took hold. Even the skeptical government official looked intrigued. "This is all fascinating," he said, "but we need to consider the practical implications. If what you're saying is true, it could revolutionize our understanding of animal intelligence, not to mention our approach to ocean conservation." Dr. Rodriguez nodded. "Exactly, which is why we need to act quickly. Every day we delay is another day the Orcas might escalate their behavior." As the meeting adjourned, plans already forming for the new research vessel, Margaret and Robert found themselves surrounded by excited scientists and officials. Questions flew at them from all directions, but Margaret's mind was elsewhere. She thought of that orca's eye staring at her with such intensity. She thought of the oceans, vast and mysterious, harboring intelligences they were only just beginning to comprehend. And she thought of the responsibility they now faced, to bridge the gap between two worlds, to hear a message that might just save them both. Later that night, as they stood on the balcony of their hotel room overlooking the sea, Robert wrapped his arm around Margaret's waist. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked softly. Margaret leaned into him, her eyes on the moonlit waves. "I'm thinking about how much has changed. A few months ago, we were just two retirees on a sailing trip. Now we're at the center of potentially the biggest scientific discovery of the century." Robert chuckled. "Life has a way of surprising you, doesn't it?" Margaret nodded, then turned to face him, her expression serious. "Bob, what if we're wrong? What if we go out there and it doesn't work? What if we can't understand them? Or worse, what if they attack again?" Robert took her hands in his gaze steady. "Then we'll have tried, Maggie. That's all we can do. But think about what happens if we're right. If we can actually communicate with another species, understand their perspective on the world we share. It could change everything." Margaret felt a smile tugging at her lips. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she felt a thrill of excitement. They were on the brink of something extraordinary, something that could redefine humanity's place in the natural world. "You're right," she said, squeezing his hands. "Whatever happens, we have to try." As they stood there, the sound of the waves, a constant backdrop, Margaret felt a sense of purpose settle over her. The Orcas had chosen them for whatever reason. Now it was up to them to see this through, to be the bridge between two worlds. The ocean stretched out before them, vast and full of secrets. But for the first time since their ordeal began, Margaret looked at it not with fear but with hope. Somewhere out there the Orcas were waiting, and soon, very soon, they would meet again. This time, not as predator and prey, but as two intelligent species reaching out across the divide, searching for understanding. The journey ahead would be challenging, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But as Margaret leaned against Robert, feeling the steady beat of his heart, she knew they were ready. Whatever the Orcas had to say, they would be there to listen. And perhaps in doing so, they might just help save the oceans and themselves. In the process, the sleek research vessel, christened the Harmony, cut through the waves with purpose. Its hull, painted in shades of blue and green to mimic the ocean itself, gleamed in the early morning light. On the bow, Margaret and Robert stood side by side, their eyes scanning the horizon. "It's been 3 days," Margaret murmured, a note of concern in her voice. What if they don't come? Robert squeezed her hand reassuringly. They'll come, Maggie. We just have to be patient. Behind them, the deck buzzed with activity. Scientists adjusted sophisticated listening equipment, while others monitored screens displaying real-time data from underwater sensors. The Harmony was a marvel of modern technology, designed specifically for this unprecedented mission to communicate with the Orcas. Dr. Rodriguez approached, her face etched with a mix of excitement and tension. We're picking up some interesting vocalizations about 10 miles southwest of our position, she reported. It could be our pod. Margaret's heart quickened. Should we move closer? Dr. Rodriguez shook her head. Not yet. We don't want to appear aggressive. Let's wait and see if they come to us. As the morning wore on, anticipation built on the ship. Every splash, every dark shape in the water sent a ripple of excitement through the crew. But still, the Orcas didn't appear. By midday, doubt began to creep in. What if they had misinterpreted everything? What if the Orcas' behavior had been nothing more than a fluke, a series of coincidences they had imbued with too much meaning? Robert noticed Margaret's furrowed brow and pulled her close. Hey, he said softly, remember why we're here. No matter what happens, we're pushing the boundaries of science, of human understanding. That counts for something. Margaret nodded, trying to take comfort in his words. But as the sun began its descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake. Just as Dr. Rodriguez was suggesting they consider moving to a new location, a shout went up from one of the researchers. Contact, multiple contacts, approaching fast from the southeast. In an instant, the deck was a flurry of activity. Margaret and Robert rushed to the railing, straining their eyes against the fading light. And then they saw them, sleek black shapes cutting through the water with impossible grace, heading straight for the Harmony. It's them, Margaret breathed, her voice filled with awe and a touch of fear. They came. As the pod drew closer, Margaret counted at least a dozen Orcas. They moved with purpose, their synchronization a testament to their intelligence and social bonds. The largest of the group, a male with a towering dorsal fin, led the way. Dr. Rodriguez joined them at the railing, her face flushed with excitement. This is incredible, she said. They're approaching much more directly than we've ever seen before. It's almost as if they recognize the ship, Robert finished, his voice hushed. The Orcas circled the Harmony, their movements curious, rather than aggressive. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as the large male swam directly up to the ship. It rolled onto its side, its eye breaking the surface to stare directly at them. It's him, Margaret whispered, gripping Robert's arm. The same one from before. I'd recognize those eyes anywhere. The Orca blinked slowly, then slapped its tail against the water. The sound echoed across the suddenly silent deck. Dr. Rodriguez nodded to a nearby researcher, who activated the underwater speakers. The haunting calls of the Orcas, recorded during their previous encounter, filled the air. The reaction was immediate. The pod began to vocalize, their calls overlapping and intertwining in a complex symphony. The male at the ship's side joined in, its powerful voice resonating through the hull. They're responding to the recordings, Dr. Chen, the linguistics expert, said excitedly. This is dialogue, actual interspecies dialogue. For hours, the exchange continued. The researchers played various recordings, and the Orcas responded each time. Patterns began to emerge. Certain calls elicited specific responses, while others seemed to prompt physical displays from the pod. As night fell, the sea around the Harmony came alive with bioluminescence. The Orcas' movements left glowing, trails in the water, creating a mesmerizing spectacle. Margaret found herself entranced, tears streaming down her face at the sheer beauty and significance of the moment. We did it, Bob, she whispered. We made contact. Robert nodded, his own eyes glistening. This is just the beginning, Maggie. We have so much to learn. As the night wore on, the Orcas' behavior shifted. They began to move with increased urgency, their vocalizations taking on a different tone. Dr. Chen frowned as she studied the readouts from their instruments. Something's changed, she said. The patterns we were seeing earlier, they're different now, more insistent. The large, male orca suddenly breached, its massive body clearing the water entirely before crashing back down. The impact sent a spray of glowing water over the deck. "They're trying to tell us something," Margaret said, a sense of urgency building in her chest. "Something important," Dr. Rodriguez nodded grimly. "I think you're right. But what?" As if in answer, the pod began to move away from the ship. But instead of disappearing into the darkness, they stopped a short distance away. The male orca slapped its tail against the water repeatedly, then dove. "They want us to follow them," Robert said, his voice filled with certainty. Dr. Rodriguez hesitated. "We can't be sure of that. It could be dangerous." Margaret turned to her, her eyes blazing with determination. "Doctor, we came here to communicate. To understand. If we turn back now, we might lose our only chance." A tense moment passed as Dr. Rodriguez weighed the risks. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but we proceed with extreme caution. At the first sign of danger, we pull back. Understood?" Margaret and Robert nodded in unison. As the Harmony's engines hummed to life, following the retreating pod, a mix of excitement and apprehension filled the air. They traveled through the night, the orcas always just ahead, leading them ever deeper into the vast expanse of the Pacific. As dawn broke, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, Dr. Rodriguez approached Margaret and Robert with a concerned expression. "We're nearing the edge of a marine protected area," she said. "It's a region known for its rich biodiversity, but it's been under threat from illegal fishing operations." No sooner had the words left her mouth than a cry went up from the observation deck. "Ships ahead, multiple contacts." As they drew closer, the scene became clear. A fleet of fishing vessels was spread out before them, their nets cast wide. And swimming among them, darting between the boats with obvious agitation, was the orca pod. "My God," Robert breathed, "they brought us here on purpose, to show us this." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. The orcas hadn't just been trying to communicate, they had been asking for help, pleading for intervention in the destruction of their home. As the Harmony approached the illegal fishing fleet, tensions ran high. The fishermen, realizing they had been caught, began to hastily pull in their nets. The orcas continued their frenzied movement, their distress evident in their vocalizations. Dr. Rodriguez was already on the radio, contacting the authorities. But Margaret knew that by the time help arrived, the fishing boats would be long gone. They needed to act now. She turned to Robert, seeing the same resolve in his eyes that she felt. Without a word, they moved to the ship's communications system. Margaret took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice carried across the water to the fishing vessels. "This is Margaret Thornton of the research vessel Harmony. You are engaged in illegal fishing in a protected marine area. We have documented your activities and have alerted the authorities. But more importantly, you are causing untold damage to a complex ecosystem and intelligent beings who call these waters home." She paused, looking out at the orcas still swimming among the boats. The large male had positioned itself directly in front of the Harmony, its eye once again locked on Margaret. "I implore you," she continued, her voice thick with emotion, "to consider the consequences of your actions. Not just the legal ramifications, but the moral ones. These waters are not empty. They are filled with life, with intelligence, with beings capable of complex thought and emotion, beings who have reached out to us, asking for our help." As she spoke, something remarkable happened. The orcas, as if understanding the gravity of the moment, began to gather behind the Harmony. They formed a line, their bodies sleek and powerful, a living wall between the research vessel and the fishing fleet. The sight was breathtaking. Human technology and cetacean intelligence united in a common cause. It was a moment that would be etched in the memories of all who witnessed it, a turning point in the relationship between humans and the oceans they had for so long taken for granted. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Margaret felt a profound sense of hope. They had crossed a threshold, opened a door to understanding that could never be closed. The journey ahead would be long and challenging, fraught with political, ethical, and scientific hurdles. But in this moment, watching the orcas swim proudly alongside the Harmony, she knew it was a journey worth taking. The Orcas had spoken. And finally, humanity was ready to listen. The conference room buzzed with tension as Margaret and Robert Thornton took their seats at the long table. Around them sat an eclectic group: marine biologists, government officials, representatives from environmental organizations, and even a few skeptical fishing industry executives. At the head of the table, Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood, her face a mask of determination. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "As you know, the events of the past few months have been unprecedented. We're here today to discuss our findings and, more importantly, to determine our path forward." Margaret felt Robert's hand squeeze hers under the table. They exchanged a glance, both knowing how much rode on this meeting. Dr. Rodriguez clicked a remote, and the large screen behind her came to life with footage from their encounters with the Orcas. "What you're seeing here is not just extraordinary animal behavior. It's communication. Complex intentional communication from a non-human species." A man in a crisp suit leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Dr. Rodriguez, while this is certainly interesting, I fail to see how it justifies the extreme measures you're proposing. The fishing industry..." "The fishing industry," Margaret interrupted, unable to stay silent, "is destroying the very ecosystem it depends on. And now we have proof that it's not just fish stocks we're decimating. We're silencing an intelligent species." The man's face reddened. "Mrs. Thornton, with all due respect, you're not a scientist. Your experiences, while dramatic..." Hardly what?" Robert cut in, his voice sharp. "Hardly scientific. We've spent months working with the top minds in marine biology, linguistics, and animal behavior. The evidence is irrefutable." Dr. Chen, the linguistics expert, stood up. "If I may," she said, her quiet voice somehow commanding attention. "We've analyzed thousands of hours of orca vocalizations. The complexity, the structure, it's far beyond anything we've previously attributed to non-human species. We're looking at a language, possibly as complex as our own." She clicked to a new slide showing spectrograms of orca calls. "Moreover, we've identified specific words, for lack of a better term, that correlate directly with human activities. They have distinct vocalizations for different types of boats, for fishing nets, for oil rigs. They're not just communicating, they're discussing us." A murmur ran through the room. Margaret saw the skepticism on some faces begin to waver. An environmental activist spoke up next. "This is exactly why we need immediate action. If the orcas are as intelligent as you say, then our current practices amount to nothing less than genocide." The fishing industry representative scoffed. "Genocide? That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? We're talking about animals here, not people." Margaret stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. All eyes turned to her. "No," she said, her voice quiet but intense. "We're talking about thinking, feeling beings. Beings who have watched us destroy their home, kill their families, and pollute their waters. Beings who, despite all that, chose to reach out to us, to try and communicate." She walked to the front of the room, standing next to the screen still, showing the orca spectrograms. I looked into their eyes. I saw intelligence there and desperation. They're not just animals. They're people. Different from us, yes, but people nonetheless. And they're asking for our help. A heavy silence fell over the room. Even the most skeptical faces now looked thoughtful. Dr. Rodriguez cleared her throat. "Thank you, Margaret. Now, let's discuss the proposal on the table. We're suggesting a radical expansion of marine protected areas, stricter regulations on fishing and oil exploration, and most importantly, the establishment of a permanent orca communication research station." The next few hours were a whirlwind of debate, discussion, and negotiation. Margaret and Robert found themselves at the center of it all, recounting their experiences, answering questions, and passionately arguing for the orcas' rights. As the meeting finally wound down, Dr. Rodriguez stood to address the room one last time. "I want to thank you all for your time and input. I know these proposals are ambitious, even radical, but we're facing an unprecedented situation. The choice we make today will define our relationship with the oceans and the intelligent life within them for generations to come." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "We'll reconvene tomorrow for final decisions. Please think carefully about what we've discussed here. The world is watching, and so are the Orcas. As people began to file out of the room, Margaret and Robert remained seated, exhausted but hopeful. Dr. Rodriguez approached them, a small smile on her face. "You did well," she said. "I think we're making progress." Robert nodded. "It's a start. But will it be enough?" Before Dr. Rodriguez could answer, a commotion at the door caught their attention. A young researcher burst in, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Dr. Rodriguez, Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, you need to come quickly. The Orcas, they're here." Exchanging startled glances, they hurried after the researcher. As they stepped outside the building, they were met with an astonishing sight. The conference center overlooked the bay, and there, just offshore, was a pod of orcas. They swam in tight circles, breaching and tail-slapping in what could only be described as a display. People poured out of the building, gasping and pointing. Phones were raised, capturing the unprecedented event. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as she recognized the large male orca at the head of the pod. "It's them," she whispered to Robert. "They followed us here." As if in response to her words, the male orca let out a haunting call. The sound carried across the water, silencing the murmuring crowd. Then, one by one, the other orcas joined in. The air filled with their complex vocalizations, a symphony of clicks, whistles, and pulsed calls. Dr. Chen, who had joined them, listened intently, her face a mask of concentration. After a few minutes, she turned to them, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's the same patterns," she said, her voice hushed with awe. "The same words we identified in our research. They're not just putting on a show, they're speaking to us. Right. Here, right now." Margaret felt a hand on her arm and turned to see the fishing industry representative standing there, his face pale. I had no idea," he stammered. "All this time we thought, but they're really trying to talk to us, aren't they?" Margaret nodded, placing her hand over his. "Yes," she said softly, "they are. And now we have a chance to listen, to make things right." As the orcas continued their display, Margaret saw people around her wiping away tears, embracing each other, their faces filled with wonder and resolve. She knew then that everything had changed. The barriers between species, between land and sea, were crumbling. The journey ahead would be long and challenging. Translating the orcas' language, reshaping human industry and behavior, learning to coexist with an intelligence so alien yet so familiar. It would take years, perhaps generations. But as Margaret stood there, Robert's arm around her waist, watching the orcas dance in the fading light, she felt a profound sense of hope. They had set out on a simple sailing trip and stumbled into the greatest discovery in human history. They had faced terror, doubt, and disbelief. But they had persevered, driven by the conviction that there was something out there worth fighting for. As the sun set over the bay, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, the orcas gave one final resounding call. Then, as one, they turned and swam out to sea, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Margaret turned to Robert, seeing in his eyes the same mix of exhaustion, exhilaration, and determination that she felt. "What now?" she asked. Robert smiled, pulling her close. "Now, my dear," he said, "we begin the real work. We've opened the door. It's time to step through." As they walked back to the conference center, surrounded by excited chatter and hurried phone calls, Margaret knew that the world would never be the same. The orcas had spoken, and humanity had finally listened. Whatever came next, they would face it together. 2 species, 1 planet, and a future full of possibilities. The end was just the beginning.